The Witch in the Wood by T.H. White, Chapter 24. When Grummore and Palomides woke up and had disentangled themselves, they went down to break their fast, not feeling quite so well as King Pellinore. Perhaps they had drank just one more glass than the king had the evening before, and this made the difference. And this may have made the difference. Wine is a dreadful mocker, we know, which always exacts every ounce of its pound of flesh as soon as the forfeit is earned. The best intentions win no forgiveness from it. It has deceived millions of middle-aged into trading the future for a little tinsel in the present, thrown down vigorous young men with a tripping foot, wreaked its remorseless dividends upon the aged and infirm. Still, it tastes nice. Sir Grummore and Sir Palomides did not feel this. Mead, they thought, has an extremely unpleasant taste. It is supposed to be made of honey and thus to bear relationship with the heather and the humming bees. Be that as it may, they continued to think. But the heather and the honey are fermented before they become the honey wine. And what is fermentation except allowing a thing to rot? What is mead except rotten honey, filthy, stinking, rotten honey, dunghill honey? And that is what we are tasting now. Sir Grummore and Sir Palomides panted out breaths of despised honey, as permanent as onions, and asked themselves the eternal question, why ever did we do it last night? Well, Grummore, asked Sir Palomides, after they had fallen back defeated from their breakfasts. Well, Palomides, yours truly supposes we couldn't lie down for a bit, do you feel? Lie down. Shut eye, said Sir Palomides, faintly closing his eyes. What about Pellinore? The Saracen made no reply. Where is Pellinore? Don't know, said Sir Palomides, using the fewest possible words. Pellinore, said Sir Grummore, also closing his eyes. They remained in silence for some time, leaning back against the wall. Then they both opened their eyes simultaneously. Indeed, there was little relief in keeping them shut, and looked upon one another with abhorrence. They looked away again immediately, like the people in the poem by A.E. Housman, and smoothed their aching brows. Had him when we started, said Sir Grummore. Gone now, said Sir Palomides with relief. Some time later, Grummore said tenaciously, he must be somewhere. Writing poems, said Sir Palomides with a shudder. Cutting them on trees, assented Grummore. They both lay back in agony, rolling their eyes up. Terrible analogy here, but we'll read it anyway. They both lay back in agony, rolling their eyes up like Negroes and wishing for the grave. Half an hour later, Sir Grummore asked, Do you hear some singing? Singing? Like birds, explained Sir Grummore. Sir Palomides listened distastefully. Buzzing, he said at last. Funny, said Sir Grummore. Thought I heard some blackbirds singing. Must have made a mistake. There! Cried Sir Grummore suddenly. Sir Palomides jumped upright and clapped his hand to his brow. Oh dear, he said. Sorry, Palomides. Never mind. Sir Palomides opened one eye cautiously and said in a quiet voice, so as not to hurt his friend, Yours faithfully can hear some sawing. Then that we can both hear, said Sir Grummore. They were sitting upon 2 oak chests in the great hall of Lothane Castle. There were the usual thick carpets draped across these chests, but they had no backs, so the knights had to lean against the stone wall. The hall was a luxurious apartment, for it faced out over the sea and the sheer cliff, and thus could afford to have big windows. On the ground floors of castles and on the sides, which can readily be attacked, you must always have small window slits to keep out the arrows and the enemy. The impregnability of the cliff prevented this, so the big windows shone down on Sir Grummore and Sir Palomides with sumptuous light. These windows were not filled with glass, for glass was still an expensive luxury in such an out-of-the-way place as Lothane. But they were stopped up with thin horn, which had been painted in heraldic colors. Perhaps, indeed, these painted horn windows were the real origin of stained glass, for it hardly seems logical to go to all the trouble of manufacturing a transparent material like glass, only to stain it afterwards and thus render it opaque. Anyway, The Lothane horn windows were painted with coats of arms of Lothane of Orkney, of Cornwall, and all the family connections, and they threw down a gay pattern upon the two sorrowful figures who reclined against the wall. High above the aching heads, for the hall occupied 2 stories of the castle, you could see the complicated ornamental rafters which supported the roof, in arches and dim cat's cradles of wood, which had been done in blue and red and black and gold. All the bevels and corbels and bosses of these distant beams were bright with paint, and at the foot of each great pin, where it dove into the wall, a carved wooden angel looked down with an unreadable expression, bearing a colored shield. Over the main dais, where King Lot sat when he was dining at home, there was a magnificent stag's head with some cobwebs on it. It was a 14-pointer. Opposite the dais, there was the minstrel's gallery, and under the gallery stood the door into the buttery. This door now opened, and the butler came in, followed by a respectful row of charming young pages. They had come to clear away the breakfast, a modest collation of tough beef, roast mutton, cold pork, high venison, last night's peacock, baked salmon, mountain hare, and various heavy pies. The 2 knights looked in the opposite direction while these meats were carted out. "More venison, Sir Knight?" inquired the butler, bowing hospitably. "No." "A little cold pork?" "No." "Just a mouthful of greasy pie?" "Oh, do go away," said Sir Grumore, waving his hands here and there. At this point the butler smiled secretly and took pity on them. He beckoned to a page who had been hovering behind him, and the child placed a tray upon their table. There were bottles on the tray. The procession bowed and withdrew. King Pellinore was in the pine wood, as his friends had suspected. The place had become a regular habitat for him lately, because the other trees in Lothane were mostly too rare and stunted to be worth cutting on. In the pine wood there were plenty of trees, and though he had taken the edge off both his daggers, his sword was still fairly sharp. The king was not actually cutting when they found him. He had been busy at it for some time, and the trees round were all shrewdly punished. But after an hour or so he had begun to feel sleepy. He had gone to his grave at a late hour the night before, and had been resurrected at an early one by the Cornwall children, so perhaps he had some excuse for it. At all events, he had sat down under the latest tree to have a rest. When the 2 ends of the questing beast arrived, marching wearily in step, they found the king with his head bowed upon his chest. His sword lay near by him in a pile of wood chips and shavings, while all over his lap there were hundreds and hundreds of primrose petals separated from their stems. The poor fellow had been playing, "She loves me, she don't, she'd have me, she won't, she would if she could, but she can't." Unfortunately, he had not noticed that all his primroses had exactly 5 petals, so the constantly repeated message had not been of a cheering nature. He had taken refuge in the arms of sleep. "Questing beast," whispered Sir Palomides, "halt." "What is it, my dear friend?" "Honorable Majesty is before us. He is asleep." "Well, do something, Palomides. I'm getting cramp." "What shall yours truly do?" "Don't stand there asking questions, my good chap. Your end don't have to walk along all the time bent double. I'll do something, Palomides. I've got the stitch." "We could unbutton for a moment," whispered the Saracen. The questing beast unbuttoned itself cautiously and stood up in 2 sections. Each section simultaneously raised a hand to its brow. The liquor which the butler had brought them had been enough to recall them to a sense of duty, but they were still unfitted for the task. "Oh, my head," whispered Sir Grumore. "Now what do we do? Could we cough? I don't know whether the questing beast does cough. The problem seems to depend upon which end is the governing factor. I don't quite follow you, Palomides." "One means, is this beast lion, leopard, hart, or snake? A snake would hardly cough." "Quite so." "And after all, the head is of a snake. This would cover the larynx, not it?" "I didn't hear there was a larynx in it," said Sir Grumore in a puzzled tone. "I thought it was a leopard." "Nothing must be done without predetermination." Well, nothing must be done without premeditation. Quite. Do you think, asked Sir Grumore cautiously after premeditating for a bit, that we could sit down behind a tree somewhere and have a nap until he wakes up? Would that be compatible with our task? I mean, pleaded Sir Grumore, we could take it in watches, turn and turn about, and of course we would stop directly he woke up. Sir Palomides tried not to look too eager. Been a long walk up, insisted Sir Grumore. They looked upon one another furtively, then slunk away to the edge of the wood, where they could keep an eye on the sleeping king without being caught when he woke. First watch shall be taken by yours ever, said Sir Palomides magnanimously, to calm his conscience. They settled themselves comfortably with their backs against two trees. In a minute they were both asleep. Perhaps this gentle spring day was the nicest there could have been for the viewing of the castle of Lothain and Orkney. It lay stretched out before the feet of the sleeping knights, sunning itself. The magic wood where they had hidden themselves grew upon the landward side of it, so that they looked down upon it from a slight eminence, and over its shoulder their closing eyes had seen the blue sea twinkling to the horizon. The village was out of sight because it lay at the bottom of the cliff. There was only the castle, and then the great drop, and then the sea. It was enough to make you snooze. King Lot's earliest ancestor, who had first begun to build the castle of Lothain, began it as a peel tower. This was the usual kind of fortification in the remote ages of the north. Just a single circular tower with no entrance on the ground floor. You climbed a ladder to a door on the first floor and pulled the ladder up after you, thus baffling the enemy. He had built it on the very edge of the cliff, where it served as a watchtower in case of marauders from the sea, and his two next descendants had been content with it as it was. Later, as the fortunes of the family improved, the peel tower had been added to. One bit by this descendant, one bit by that. Now it was a big square castle with a tower at each corner, but the old tower was still the biggest one. It was the great keep of the finished fortification. Sir Palomides and Sir Grumore were accustomed to castles, so they could afford to sleep. If they had stayed awake, they could have amused themselves for hours, spying down into the cobbled courtyard and watching how life went on. They could have watched the shadow of the lantern in the roof of the great hall, how it slowly boxed the compass, and the other shadows of the stone falcons, Night and Death, who guarded the top of the inner stairs, which now led to the first floor entrance of the keep, once approached by that ancestor's movable ladder. The whole place was a charm of shadows, for the shades of the gatehouse and the four towers marched round it in ceaseless sentry-go, alerting the aspect of the castle for every hour of the day. The big painted sundial, indeed, which stood over the door, leading to the screens between buttery and hall, threw a finger of darkness, which was an unnecessary luxury. You could tell the time by merely standing in the court. The castle of Lothain had a variety of texture which depended on the sunlight. All the huge blocks from which it had been built were surrounded by the slight depressions of the mortar, so that the stones could be made to stand out in patterns if the sun were in the right place, like oat cake or wholemeal biscuit. Then the ringing cobbles of the courtyard made a pimply surface to the ground. They were flint pebbles carted up from the sea, and from this height they looked like the old-fashioned suites called hundreds and thousands. On the landward side of the castle, where the gatehouse and the drawbridge were, a deep gully gashed the landscape with a blue shade. The drawbridge went over this. There was the rose garden and the bowling green, making a little rash on the undefended side of the gully. It was not worth defending roses, and perhaps the most curious piece of texture, there was a little herb garden on the very top of each tower, except the great keep. The keep had a conical slate roof, after the French fashion, so that no herbarium was possible there, but the other three towers all had their little flower beds on them. The sentries had to walk among the castle vegetables, careful not to spoil some titbit for the king's dinner, or a herbal rarity, excellent for the whitening of the queen's complexion, or any of the medicinal greens which the doctor used when the soldiers came to him with pains in their stomachs. All this together with the pennonsills and coast guard signals which flew from the flagstaffs looked very gay in the summer. It was gayest of all when the king was in residence, for then the royal standard floated in stately dignity from the top of the great keep. And that is the end of chapter 23.